Welcome back to the Microsoft 365 Business Technical Fundamentals series. In this module, we'll be discussing hybrid identity. If you are unfamiliar with this term, it means having a traditional on-prem Active Directory account synchronizing into Azure Active Directory. This allows users to leverage the same credentials to access on-premises resources, such as traditional file and print solutions, and also seamlessly accessing cloud solutions, including those based on Microsoft 365 Business. Let's start with an overview of the different authentication options Microsoft provides for hybrid identity to help you choose the one that is most appropriate for you. As mentioned, the main idea with hybrid identity is to allow users to have a single identity, which can be used across a range of business-related services, including being able to leverage almost 3,000 integrated SaaS applications with Azure AD. What you can see here is that while we tend to talk about on-premises Active Directory, the reality is that you may already be hosting this in a cloud environment, such as running virtual machines with the domain controller role in an Azure network, for example. For the content we'll be covering in this slide and this presentation, the term on-premises Active Directory is going to be used generically to talk about Active Directory, regardless of whether you're hosting it or whether it is something that you are running on-prem. When we start looking at the different solutions available for enabling hybrid identity, the key component that is required is the center component, Azure Active Directory Connect. You may be aware of earlier names for this tool. Originally it was known as DirSync and then as AAD Sync before settling on AAD Connect a couple of years ago. This is a relatively small download with a wizard-driven installation to help you configure it quickly and easily. It requires Windows Server 2008 Standard Edition or higher, and it's not supported on Small Business Server or Windows Server Essentials. While it's not normally a best practice in larger organizations, in a smaller organization with a single server that is the domain controller, installing AAD Connect onto that DC is a supported situation. The URL at the bottom of the screen is a link with a lot more detail around what the system requirements are to see that if you can actually get this installed without having to invest in additional hardware. As mentioned, one of the benefits of hybrid identity is that we can use one identity to access traditional and cloud-based resources, and this simplifies the user experience while also helping to improve security-based identity, so we can start leveraging capabilities such as multi-factor authentication. The preferred option that we have for most Microsoft 365 business customers that require hybrid identity is to use the password hash sync capability. The reason why we recommend this option is that you can probably install AAD Connect onto an existing server or virtual machine. Password hash sync, it's a feature that's used to synchronize user passwords from an on-prem AD instance to a cloud-based Azure AD instance. You can use this feature to sign into Azure AD services such as Microsoft 365 Business, as well as related, other related Microsoft and third-party solutions. You sign into the service by using the same password that you're using to sign into your on-prem AD instance. The Active Directory domain service, it stores those user passwords in the form of a hash value representation of the actual user password. And the hash value is a result of a one-way mathematical function known as the hashing algorithm. There's no method to revert the result of a one-way function to the plain text version of a password. So this is a question that does come up a bit when we do talk about password hash sync. People think that we're talking about password synchronization. At no point is the user password actually synchronized into the cloud. Instead, what happens is that Azure AD Connect sync, it goes through, it extracts the password hash from the on-prem Active Directory instance, it applies additional security processing to that password hash, and then it synchronizes it into Azure Active Directory. The next option, pass-through authentication, it doesn't require the synchronization of the hashed password details into Azure Active Directory. Instead, user authentication is against a cloud service, is actually redirected back through AAD Connect to your on-prem domain controllers. You'll notice that I said domain controllers, plural. The reason why I mention this is that you need to have a running and responding domain controller to allow the user authentication from outside of the network. This also means that network reliability and congestion can also have an impact on the user experience, so you really need to plan for a high performance and highly available infrastructure if you want to go down the path of this type of deployment. It's also got a minimum requirement of Windows Server 2012 R2 or later to run Azure AD Connect with this functionality enabled, and to start enabling some of these higher availability scenarios with it, you would need to deploy a second instance on another Windows Server 2012 R2 by using the pass-through authentication agent. The reason why someone would go down this path is that they may have additional restrictions that require the user to be authenticated against an on-prem domain controller rather than Azure Active Directory. But for most customers that would be looking at Microsoft 365 Business, we really don't think this would be the appropriate option for them. The final option that we have here is Active Directory Federation services being used in conjunction with Azure AD Connect. Now, this is definitely not something we'd recommend for a smaller organization, and the reason is that the infrastructure requirements are even higher. So we need to go through, configure multiple instances of multiple roles. We need to ensure that things like load balancers are set up to ensure that traffic is being directed appropriately. And generally speaking, it's just not something that scales down very well in a reliable manner to a smaller deployment. And if we thinking about deploying this for a smaller customer, it's really a lot of infrastructure that's required, and in most cases we're probably really thinking about trying to reduce some of the infrastructure that they're actually using here. So to start bringing some of these previous talking points together, the recommendation that I mentioned was to use password hash synchronization due to the low footprint and the ease of deployment. For smaller customers that only have a single server that is a domain controller, provided it meets the necessary requirements, we may be able to install AAD Connect on that server, so making it a very easy decision. So larger organizations would generally be using AAD Connect for longer term integration scenarios, but for smaller customers who are just basically think about using it for migration purposes, we could use it as a tool to assist migrations because it won't just synchronize the users, but it will also synchronize other objects such as security groups and their members. Now, it's important to note, the reason why this can be critical is even in a small organization, we can have an extensive number of groups that are in use to control access to resources, and you probably want to leverage them immediately rather than having to create them again from scratch in a cloud environment. And finally, one of the more recent features that's been enabled in AAD Connect is that it's been updated to assist with a capability known as hybrid domain join, which is something that we'll cover in the next slide. So as we start taking a look at hybrid domain join, some of the important things here are that what we can start doing here is we can start lighting up new experiences in Windows 10 Active Directory domain join devices. We can start getting single sign-on from anywhere. We can get enterprise compliant roaming of user settings across joined devices. And if that's something that you're interested in, take a look at the Azure Active Directory module that preceded this one, which is the Cloud Identity, where I showed where you enable that functionality. Now we can also do things like use our work account. So rather than using a Microsoft account to access things like the store, the Microsoft Store, we can actually go through now and just use our Azure Active credentials instead. And it also helps to set up capabilities such as Windows Hello for Business if we want to start using pins and biometrics to allow simplified sign-in for the users while still maintaining a high degree of security. Now, as I mentioned, AAD Connect is a fundamental piece to enabling this functionality, and it does, the things that it does in particular are that, first of all, it creates an object in Active Directory, and this is called a service connection point. This enables domain joined PCs to know the Azure AD tenant to which it belongs. It then syncs the computers in AD to Azure AD as device objects, and what this does is it enables the computers to securely authenticate upon automatic registration with Azure AD. Let's jump onto a domain controller so we can see an AAD Connect installation and we can start seeing some of the new capabilities that have been set up for hybrid domain join. So even though you can see here that I already have Azure AD Connect installed, I just want to quickly jump you out to downloads from Microsoft. So you can see that the Microsoft Azure Active Directory Connect package is available for download. If we expand that out, it's just under 82 meg, so it's not a very large file, and that downloads quickly. But installation can take a while depending on the resources and the performance of your domain controller or the server that you're installing this onto. So rather than going through that process, instead, let's just jump in and run through some of the important configuration options for Azure AD Connect. What's important to note here is that as soon as we open that after we've already done that installation, then what will happen is it actually pauses the scheduler. So if you forget to go through and exit out or finish the steps that you're doing, so let's say you get distracted and you forget to come back in again, you will receive an email notification eventually letting you know that synchronization hasn't occurred for a certain amount of time. So if you do get one of those emails, it's not necessarily something that you have to panic about. You may just be able to sort of, retrace your steps and realize that this could be the reason why. So what we want to do here is jump in and take a look at the customized synchronization options. We need to type in the Azure AD credentials. So we basically need to enter in global admin credentials here. So I'll just type those in. So you can see here that it's connecting, it's verifying that the account is global admin. And what's when we can see here that I've gone through, I've actually got a registered domain name. So I've actually verified the domain name against this. And I've also set it up here just for the sake of simplicity so that my on-prem AD is the same as my cloud identity. So this makes it very, very simple for users. Now there are a variety of ways that you can go through and address this on-prem if you are still using different names internally, or in some cases, there are still situations where people are still using the good old .locals from their initial their initial Active Directory installs. So what we can start doing here is we can either synchronize everything, so all of the domains. In this case, it's only a single domain. It really doesn't have a lot in it. Or we can just start choosing to select particular OUs or particular domains, so that if it was a multi-domain forest, for example, but again, in a Microsoft 365 business environment, the chances are it's going to be a single forest, single domain. Now, just for the sake of simplicity, I'll keep this as sync all because this is an empty environment. But you might need to be careful of this, just letting it do the default of synchronizing everything in a production environment, because you might have something sitting down here, such as users who no longer work for the company, where you've got a whole bunch of archived accounts of former employees. And you don't really want those user objects syncing across to Azure Active Directory. You're getting this chance to actually have something that's nice and clean, so we can actually start using this as part of that process. But for the sake of this one, I'll just say sync all domains and OUs. Now for the feature, you'll see that I've only got one feature enabled here, the password hash sync. So obviously this is the one that I've said we strongly recommend this as the default or your go-to option when you are deploying Azure Active Directory Connect in most Microsoft 365 business scenarios. So it's going through now and it will do the configuration. So this won't take very long. So we'll just let this run through, and I don't actually want it to start the synchronization process when the configuration completes, because I actually want to go through and do a few more things here. So I'll actually exit all the way out of this because I don't actually want to make those changes. Instead, what I want to highlight here is configuring device options. So I mentioned that one of the things that we can do now is start getting Azure Active Directory Connect to do some of the work that's required for the hybrid Azure AD join. So as you can see here, it enables the devices in your AD forest to register with Azure AD for access management. So this is the topic we just mentioned. So it will go through, automatically discover Azure AD using the service connection point, so that you can start letting users and devices access cloud-based resources without being prompted for additional credentials. So let's just take a look at some of the things that are required here. So again, you'll see that I'll need to sign in again. So just let me enter in my tenant admin name. It helps if I can type correctly. Now, the option that we want here is the one that it's selected, Configure Hybrid Azure AD Join. Now, what you can see here is we can see the forest. So that's the forest that I want. And I actually need to go through and add my enterprise admin credentials. So let's just go through and add those. and I'll hit next. So what we can now see, the next two options. So do we want to enable this for Windows 10 or later domain joined devices? So, effectively, the Windows 10 versions that would be recommending you use as part of your Microsoft 365 business subscription, or that are installed on your new PCs. But also, we know that there will still be some people using down-level versions of Windows. They might still be using Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 for a bit longer. So this means we can also go through and configure those at the same time. So now we can go through, we can get it to make sure that everything's in place so that it can actually go through the configuration. And if I go through now and hit configure, it goes through, and now it tells me that there are some extra steps, so I can follow the link through. So this does some of the heavy lifting for you, but it's worth then jumping into the link here to see the additional steps that are required. But for now, we'll leave it there. That just gives you a quick look at what Azure Active Directory Connect looks like, as well as the default options you should be thinking about when you're deploying this for Microsoft 365 business customers. Thank you for watching this video. For more information on the topics covered, take a look at the links provided as additional resources for these videos, and make sure you check out the other videos in this series.